Okay, hi there. Yeah, this is just for the lower six in lieu of the lesson today. Basically, there's two things that I talked about with the borders. The first one is the concept of macroeconomic equilibrium, and the second issue was the Keynesian view on what causes unemployment, and also what should governments and central banks do about it. So if we just talk about the first issue first, macroeconomic equilibrium. What is it? Well, if you remember back to your GCSE science lessons, you'll remember that equilibrium is a state of balance between two equal but opposing forces. So, in a macro context, the two equal but opposing forces are the level of aggregate demand and the level of aggregate supply. And the economy, the level of real GDP, the level of output and employment, will settle into an equilibrium at the output level where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Why? Well, just common sense, really. If aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, firms, if they have spare capacity, will want to produce more in order to generate more revenue and profit. On the other hand, if aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, then firms won't be able to sell all of the output that they've produced. They'll start to build stock, and stock building reduces profit. To prevent that loss of profit, then what firms will tend to do is reduce output levels. So GDP will naturally fall if AD is less than aggregate supply. Okay, so there we go. So the economy is in equilibrium at the level of real GDP, where aggregate demand is equal to the level of aggregate supply. Keynesians believe that the economy can come into equilibrium at any level of real GDP. The only precondition is that the level of aggregate demand must be stable. If the level of AD is stable, by definition, the economy will be in equilibrium. If the level of aggregate demand is increasing, the economy will move to a new, higher equilibrium level of output. Why? Well, again, the starting point is that we've got to assume that at present the level of output is well below the full employment output level. Firms in the economy have got spare capacity, so Keynesians assume that if the level of aggregate demand rises and firms have got spare capacity, the result will be an increase in output. Firms will respond to the increase in demand by producing more if they're able to produce more. And that will be the case if the economy is operating with some unemployment a long way from the part of the long run aggregate supply curve that becomes perfectly price inelastic. Um, Similarly, the equilibrium level of output and employment can fall. That will happen when the level of aggregate demand falls. So, in summary, then, in terms of equilibrium, the economy can come into equilibrium at any level of output and employment in a Keynesian world. All that matters is whether the level of aggregate demand is stable. So, you could have an economy that's stuck at a very, very low level of output. Unemployment's over 3 million, and the economy's just stuck there, and it's in equilibrium. It's in equilibrium because the level of aggregate demand is stable. It's just stable at a very, very low level. Okay, so the next issue is the causes of unemployment. We also talked about that. Unemployment is caused by a lack of aggregate demand. That's what the Keynesians believe. Um, what can governments do about it? What can policymakers do about it? Well, basically two things. They can either run a fiscal deficit. That's a situation where planned government spending is greater than tax income. That's called expansionary fiscal policy. The other thing that could happen is that the central bank might decide to loosen monetary policy. In other words, cut interest rates, or in more recent times, try to boost the money supply by using quantitative easing. Both of those policies are reflationary demand side policies. They're designed to increase the level of aggregate demand to push the economy to a new equilibrium output level at a higher level of real GDP. If firms have to produce more goods and services, they'll need extra factors of production, including labour. Firms will take on people, as a result employment levels will rise and there'll be a corresponding fall in unemployment. So basically, the Keynesians believe that if there's unemployment, all that policymakers need to do is to chuck in more aggregate demand, and they can do that through fiscal policy or through monetary policy. This approach will work fine so long as there's spare capacity in the economy. If there isn't, of course, as soon as some firms in the economy are producing as much as they can, then if the government's using reflationary demand side policies at that point, there will be some inflation, because the firms that are already producing as much as they can won't be able to produce more in response to the increase in demand. Instead, they'll raise prices, and that, of course, causes inflation. I'll also tweet up some fact sheets, worksheets about this, so you can have a read of this tonight. And tomorrow I'll have constructed some sort of a data response question to try to sort of test whether you've understood this or not. Okay, thank you. See you tomorrow.